Principal of Memorial Pathway Academy in Garland, IZ, Garland, USA, ready for the PGP podcast. And you might be saying, ¿Qué pasó? ¿Dónde está esta gente? Where are you? What happened? I thought we were meeting at 4 p.m. Central. Look, this is a reality. The reality is this, is that football is king. That's the reality. And you know what? You got to go where your audience is. And I respect them East Coast people. I respect them West Coast people. But you know what? You got to respect the NFL. All I saw on TV was college football. All I saw was Friday Night Lights. And there ain't no better than Friday Night Lights in Texas. But ultimately, the number one thing is this, is that this is a group of episodes where we get the best of the best from out there. You know what? We're very fortunate to make sure that we're able to attract talent. Like we have a talented guest tonight, Kevin, and other individuals that are in the past and in future episodes, because it's an archive of knowledge. And that's why we're here, making sure that we put out the best product out there, because hey, you, Wisconsin, you're not alone. Hey, you, South Dakota, you're not alone. Idaho, haven't heard from you in a while. You're not alone. This is a way for you to get free information, free tools for your enhancement. So it's one of those things that we invite you in our new time slot. We'll go back to 4 p.m. after the Super Bowl. We realize that, but you know what? You have to have a pattern of behavior. That's the only way this old man gets through life, is making sure you have established patterns of behavior and what you do that will equal success. What do you think about that, Dr. Moreno?
Josh, let me just tell you something. That is so sweet of you to think about those mighty football guru fans out there, right? And we're putting it right in between that, right before that 7 o'clock kickoff, right? So this is perfect. So you know what? I'm sure everybody out there is going to appreciate the time slot being moved. But you know what? I'm super excited because today we talk about what I absolutely love, which is school discipline. Right? It's a topic that's out there that people want to learn, want to know more about, and how do we support our kids? And so, you know what? I'm super excited that we have an amazing guest today, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say.
And I'd just like to bridge over from our episode 2, Jonathan Cransford, who discussed ISS. All of these podcasts are intertwined with each other. And so you want to go back to how to run ISS in an effective, same methodology as Kevin. Reach out to our second podcast. But we before we get into that handsome devil, who I'm seeing him right here in the ready to come in. I like to give a big heartwarming and un abrazo to one of our colleagues, Mari, that used to sit in the chair, still in the chair. Her name is Kendra Rogers. If you don't know about Kendra Rogers, and I'm glad that Jefe brought her up, it's devastating to me when I saw her video from their board in Corsica ISD. Corsicana. And she's an assistant principal who went into a behavior unit. And if you've never worked in a behavior unit, you really haven't faced a lot of adversity in education, because it takes a lot of talent to deal with students that are in behavior units. And the young lady went in there with another peer, another colleague, an assistant principal, and the child, for lack of a better term, you might consider it crude. I'm not trying to be crude, but it is the fact he was out of control. All right. And nowadays, the bad thing about it is that we can't use reality, because when you're the administrator, and I've been in those shoes where kids are throwing stuff at you, you're going to be using other words in your head. Let me tell you, because you know what? You're thinking about yourself as a dad. You're thinking yourself as an uncle, as a grandpa, and you're going into a classroom and they're throwing chairs at you.
Yeah.
And this poor young lady, not only was she blocking chairs with chairs, think of that scenario. And you know what? I'm not besmirching our beautiful field. This is an anomaly. Stuff like this does happen. If you think about the millions upon millions of interactions across the United States, this is an anomaly. But still, it's out there. And it is our duty as being part of the PGP podcast with this lady, 30 years of experience, my 30 years of experience, Kevin with 20 plus years of experience, is that we let you know we need to provide you with tools of how to deal with this. So the young man threw a
Hanger.
hanger
Hanger.
and it knocked her eye out of her socket. And it looks like she's going to lose her eyesight.
It's sad. Yeah.
It's an anomaly. But you see, these are the kind of things that we need. This is why we have Kevin. We need to have certain tools on how to defuse situations.
Mm-hmm.
The days of bend over and let me paddle you with that big ass stick with holes in it, Kevin. You know what I'm talking about, Kevin, right? You know what I'm talking about. And you will hear the whoosh. There's a sound, a whoosh. And then you hear the soft. And if you move, you hear a smack. And you don't want that smack because it's the bottom of your leg.
Yeah.
I know some of you got PTSD, what I just said. Those are the old days. You see, you know, we don't want face legalities. And plus, you know, that's not in the best interest of kids or our profession. We're here to support. But I just like to give a big shout out to the family of Ms. Rogers. I'd like to send her mucho amor, un beso. That the best thing that we can do in a situation like this is that her situation is all our situation.
Yes.
Because let me tell you, and I'll close with this. If something happens to you in a negative way when you're sitting in the classroom, when you're sitting in the assistant principal's chair, when you're a bus driver with 50 kids, and you're going through all of this turmoil in your head, you feel very lonely. People don't reach out to you. And when it's bad, they say, oh, I don't want to reach out to them because they want to be left alone. You know what? Let me tell you, reach out. Reach out when people are going through emotional pain, emotional situations like this. We don't know what happened with a kid. I'm not going to put I wasn't there. Just like I tell parents, Mari, I don't know what you used to tell parents. And Kevin, I'm pretty sure you said this when you were an administrator.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I wasn't there. And Mom, you weren't there. There's three sides to the issue.
Exactly.
The kid, and you put the truth together.
And the truth, yes, sir.
Because your eyes are unbiased. And Mom, you cannot be hearing to your son or your daughter 100% because you know what? There's three sides to that story. So let's make sure that we work together because the kid's not all responsible. The administration school's not all responsible, and the parents not all responsible. It takes all three of us to make sure that we journey with that kid from pre-K to graduation day and work together to gain those tools for success. And this is why we have exactly this awesome, mucho amor, Señorita Rogers, mucho amor, family Rogers. And you know what? Let's just start off with our awesome guest today, Kevin Curtis. Bienvenido. Welcome, Kevin Curtis, to the PGP podcast. And we're glad that you're here, hermano.
Brother, thank you all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share a voice in education. And as you just pointed out, it is so tough to be in education and to support education at this time. But like you said, man, I watched the videos, I've seen the comments, my heart goes out to her and every other educator that is just struggling with all of the reality of what our world has turned into. But I'm hoping that through some of our conversations today, that we can glean some insight and some inspiration and some words of wisdom between the three of us as we put our heads together to share how we can inspire and motivate education to be what it exactly needs to be, which is be there for our kids and our teachers. And so I'm excited about sharing this platform and an opportunity to share some time with y'all today.
Muchas gracias, hermano. Hey, a big shout out to Jorge Valenzuela for being here. Hey, George, I haven't had a phone like for 4 or 5 days, which has been killing me. But I'll catch up on your podcast, bro. I'm only one episode behind, but thank you for being here tonight. Hey, you know what, Kevin? Let's talk about who Kevin Curtis is. I know facts. I know tons of people know you, brother. I was at your conference, and you know what? I enjoyed everything that you brought to the table. It made me a better individual, but we can't assume just because I've heard your podcast. I can't assume because I've been at your conference. I can assume that everyone in Wisconsin knows you. I can't assume that the Dakotas know you. And you know what? You bring a valuable resource for people in the Dakotas, in Idaho, Iowa. So tell the people, who is Kevin Curtis? What roles have you served in education? And which one was your favorite?
Thank you, brother. So I tell people all the time. So I have experience. This is my 27th year beginning. I have experience at the elementary, the middle school, the high school. principal, assistant principal, classroom teacher, instructional coach, and I was a high school football coach here in the great state of Texas for 10 years. So when I tell people, when you look at my DNA, D is going to stand for discipline. When you look at my RNA, R stands for relationships. So if you could read between that joke of DNA and RNA, I taught high school science, primarily integrated physics, biology, chemistry, speech, health, PE, and 1 year of sixth grade math that I don't really like to talk about because that was very traumatic for me. It was my first year teaching. And when state of Texas says you can teach one outside of your field, I remember being a first year teacher and my principal saying, hey, could you teach sixth grade math? And to be honest, Dr. Moreno, I said, I could solve sixth grade math. And so what's funny is it's very humbling that you get up on a chalkboard back then and you start solving math problems. And the kids are like, Coach Curtis, I think you got that wrong. And I'm like, yeah, you want to help me out? Like maybe we can work together, right? So it was humbling. But realistically, it's so funny. After being at all three levels, though, I will tell you, when you say, what is your favorite? I laugh because I think God has a huge sense of humor because even though I spent a majority of time at middle school, I say it was my least favorite. And let me just put some parameters around it because it pushed more buttons inside me as a human being than any other grade level. Like at the elementary, you're a rock star. At the high school, the middle school, oh my God. And in fact, Dr. Murray, in fact, we had this phrase, and like I said, I'm going to share some things, but we had this phrase with the adults called don't go 13. And what that simply means is, Dr. Moreno, don't be 13. Don't act 13. And I don't know about you, but I was, at that point, I was in my mid to late 40s, and I'm extremely talented at being 13. Like, I don't know. I have a special gift. When a kid goes 13, I'm like, what did you say? And all of a sudden I'm like, dang, did I just go 13 on that kid, right? Or with that adult? And so when you say it's your favorite, it was my least favorite because it pushed more buttons inside me.
Thank you for sharing that, Kevin. Hey, big shout out. Jefe, Principal Cafel is on the PGP podcast, part of the Fantastic Four, closing off the bookshelves. Jefe and Dot McKeever Cheever, as always, part of the Fantastic Four familia. Welcome for being here tonight. And Jefe, remember, you're the one that dropped the bug in my ear. Hey, Josh, it's football season. You might want to change the time. And I say, wisdom. Jefe. Shout out to you. Go ahead, Mari.
Hey, so I have a question for you. I'm curious, who or what motivated you to become an educator?
Oh, great question. So actually it was my fourth grade teacher, Miss Bagby. In fact, on my podcast, I did a solo episode where I just thanked her. But in fourth grade, my teacher said, if you finish your work efficiently and effectively, you could help other students, right? Tutor, work with them. And I remember coming back one time and I helped these students be successful in their smiles and they were so proud. And so therefore, Mari, I was proud. And I came back and I remember asking her, is this what it's like being a teacher? And she said, yes. And so I tell people all the time, in fourth grade, the seed was planted, the bug was planted.
Wow.
I didn't know what kind of teacher, but I knew I was inspired to be a teacher since I was in fourth grade.
Wow. What puts you at what, 8?
Yeah.
8 years old? Wow. I mean, that's amazing. And then you look at you, not only just a great educator, but a phenomenal educator that's written books and has done so much, right? So, I mean, that is so amazing. And it's just proof to show you that teachers really do plant seeds.
Oh, well,
right?
So let me add to that, Dr. Moreno, so I grew up a family of 5. I'm the youngest by 8.5 years. So 3 brothers and a sister. Mm-hmm. My dad was in the military. My mom was a food stamp caseworker. But growing up with an 8.5 year gap, younger than I was the youngest by 8.5 years. So all of my siblings are born either January, February, or March. Like my parents were on a procreation schedule. I don't know what was going on, but bam, bam, bam. I got siblings, right? But then 8.5 years later, I'm a September baby. In fact, my birthday's coming up next month, September 12th, I'll be 55. And so all I know is I tell my mom, my siblings love to call me the accident. I prefer surprise. I just tell my mom, you saved the best for last, right? And it's so funny. In fact, I have a shirt. It's downstairs, but it says, 55 years ago, I was the fastest swimmer. So at the end, all I know is I won the race. Here I am. But here's what was growing up for me, because you mentioned 8 years old. So at 9 years old, I was actually introduced to marijuana by my older siblings. I was cut my first line of cocaine at 12. So my brothers were into drugs and alcohol and addiction. And realistically, unfortunately, all three of my brothers have lost their lives due to drug and alcohol related deaths. But why am I here today? I'm not a statistic, was because that 8.5-year gap was just long enough for me to go, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I want to put my parents through that. My parents didn't touch this stuff. And so I tell people all the time, what saved me from being a statistic was the fact that teachers and coaches poured into me, and they taught me things that I didn't even know about myself. Like, they believed in me more than I believed in myself. And so I give all the credit to education, teachers. And so for me, what I'm doing now is I'm just giving back to education what it gave to me. And to me, it's a blessing to be able to share my experiences and wisdoms and to just share with people that, you know what, I think as adults, we can make a huge difference in our children's lives under the right circumstances. So I appreciate that.
Wow.
And welcome
Thank you for
to
sharing.
the show, Shika Houston, second member of the Fantastic Four on Saturday. Nice to have you here, Shika. And she's on a vacation. Where are you? Martine. Some little island. I don't know. This Hispanic don't know where that island is, but I know you're enjoying yourself out there. Hey, Kevin, you know what? Part of my vision for this podcast, it has to do with the exodus in education. All right. And the way that we're not replenishing via college. We're replenishing via alt certs. And a lot of people believe that you have to be like you, what you just described. No, her and I, we're not that. So we come from different parts. So tell the audience two things, all right? Tell the audience, how were you as a kiddo? How were you as a student in high school and college? You know, don't give me like the War and Peace version of it, but give me, how were you as a student, and how was your first year in the classroom?
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I chose a different path. So I was quarterback of the football team, president of National Junior Honor Society, president of Student Council. So I could live this dual life of partying with my brothers and getting straight A's and B. I graduated with the highest GPA of all male athletes at my high school, John Jay High School, Northside, San Antonio. So for me, I was setting myself up to go to college and to do something different with my life. And so for me, I only had one referral, Josh, my entire educational career. It was in 7th grade. I got 3 days of ISS for a zero tolerance policy for PDA. I kissed my girlfriend in the hall. And I remember his name, Mr. Godfrey. He wore a green and a brown tie. I remember him walking up to me and he said, "Hey, I need to see you in the office." And I was like, "I'm an office aide." I knew exactly what that asked. Now, if you could read between the line back then, we good kids got to work in the office, right? But I remember him sitting down, Josh, and it was the only time I ever got in trouble. So I was a really good student, a model student. And so that was inspiring for me, as I wanted to please the adults. I wanted to make them proud. So I'm definitely a people pleaser, particularly teachers and coaches. And so that's who I was in school. Now, don't get me wrong. I skipped school. I did a lot of things, but I just didn't get caught. Right. So just understand that. Right. So I'm not perfect, but for the most part, I was a good student. When you look at first year teaching, I think the biggest challenge for me was really trying to get my feet on the ground. I think back when I reflect on it, because I think like during the interview process, we'll ask teachers, new teachers, and as you said, they're coming from different variety of different directions. But we always end up touching on discipline and behavior. And I laugh because when we ask a new teacher who hasn't spent a lot of time in the classroom, we're like, "Hey, what's your philosophy on classroom management?" Or something like that, right? And they read and they tell you this stuff. And I tell people all the time, when you're going to find out what your philosophy of classroom management is, when you shut the door and there's 20 plus kids and it's just you and them in the room. That is when you find out what your true classroom management strategy is, because you don't have a book. You don't have a Vita or a resource or something there. I mean, ultimately, it is you and those kids. And so I think back, Josh, for my first year, it was trying to find that footing of how do I become a discipline? How do I become like love and care? So discipline and relationships, I think, was always a dual fight for me. But for me, it was really trying to figure out how do I fit my personality into this classroom?
Thank you for sharing that. Hey, I'd like to welcome with Mr. Craig Shapiro. Shap, he's part of this book that I helped write together. He has also a great podcast called Cutting the Crap with Shap. So that guy is down to it. And you know what? If you didn't like that word, I'm sorry. We say that. Plus, it's on his YouTube channel, and he wasn't censored. Welcome, Shap. Go ahead, Marty.
So before we kind of delve into your book, can you just talk just briefly about the first of all, do you have your book near you?
So I don't actually have it in my hand because it doesn't come out till
It doesn't-
October 8th. So right now we're doing prior, advanced praises, getting everything up and running. So I don't have a physical copy of it. But yes, it's coming out October 8th.
October, what's the title of it? Do you know the title?
Sure,
October?
it's the connection-driven classroom, proactive and practical tools to improve student behavior.
Awesome. So why this book? Talk a little bit just in not in details. We'll talk a little bit more in details later, but just kind of why this book? Why did you write this book? And when did you have time to write it anyways?
Well, so first of all, I wish that I could be like El Jefe, Josh, like, Principal Kafeli is talking about how many words he writes and all these things. This book for me has been birthing for about 4 or plus years. One thing we didn't touch on is, so I started, I was on the first campus in the entire state of Texas to pilot restorative practices at Ed White Middle School. So, I looped up with my kids. We piloted this. Then I started working for TEA, traveling across all 20 service centers. So that gave me my background and getting my feet wet in consulting and working with schools. And then once I started doing that, I started learning so much about classroom behavior, building relationships and connecting with kids, holding them accountable. So I think, Dr. Moreno, where this book came from is it really came from a culmination of a lot of approaches and a lot of tools where I accidentally, and I say this truly because I accidentally discovered that there was nobody teaching teachers how to connect with kids. And so where the book came from was I'm doing all these trainings and people are like, where can I read about that? And I'm like, well, it's kind of up here, right? I pulled something from here, I pulled something from there, but they're like, other than giving us the PDF of your presentation, how can I learn more about this? And so what really pushed me to drive this book it needed to come from a training and it needed to spread this message because the methodology and the philosophy resonated with so many educators, but nobody was really talking about it the way I was. And so for me, birthing this book was to share my message about how connections and accountability, particularly connections in the classroom, can really transform the classroom.
And you know what? That's something that you're right. There's so much information, but when you have to be pulling from all these different places, you want to kind of get it in one central location where you can kind of learn and try and implement some of these things, right? So that's great. I'm so glad that you are able to put what's in here into a book.
and that wasn't really easy either. Like, having a peer to put it down on paper that would actually resonate and be an easy read. But I truly say this, I've had over these 10 years of consulting, it was almost interesting because I didn't quite get a lot of the things until the moment, but I love the real life stories. Like I was training at one point we had 14 school districts just in the DFW area. So the DFW area was like my second home, but I say this profoundly because I was finished training up in Arlington. I was leaving for the day and the principal came up to me and said, here's what I love about today's training. It was motivational, it was experiential, but here's what he blew me away. He said, for 20 years, I've told my staff the importance of building relationships and connecting with kids. But he said, but what they're leaving with today is the how-to. And I shook his hand and I jumped on my little Southwest flight back to San Antonio, where I'm originally from. And on my mind, I kept thinking, is that what we do? Is that what I'm doing? Like I was so clueless that I was actually teaching something and closing a gap. I didn't even know the gap was there. So that wasn't my original message. I entered the restorative practices arena for alternatives to suspension and holding kids accountable and community building circles and all of these things. And somehow I stumbled upon this gap of nobody teaches teachers how to connect with kids. And I was like, wow, even as a principal, Josh, I had to reflect and go, I never thought about that. Like that was a aha moment for me. And in the book, I referenced like a 2x4. It was like, bam, it hit me. And I was like, wow, if nobody's teaching teachers how to connect with kids, then where are they learning it from? And if I'm only doing it in a training, I got to get it into a book. So that's really what pushed me to get that book out.
Yeah, and especially when we have a lot of alternative certification teachers out there, right, that are not even going through the whole education degree. You know, how do we get them with the tools to kind of help them in the classroom, right, and providing those alternative discipline possibilities. Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's not go into that right there, Kevin, because I know that's one of our spotlight points for tonight, specifically that. But before we get into that, you know, like we've mentioned right now, we're like at a crossroads with the influx of brand new educators. You know, Mari's generation and mine, we're a little bit older, and we're about to tap out into sitting in the chair. We're already at the retirement age, and the thing is, we need to make sure that we provide the future with the best tooled individuals who might be coming from industry, who might be coming from different parts. And discipline is one of the biggest things that chases people away, especially like you said, Kevin, when you don't have someone sitting in our chair, my chair, or the assistant principal chair that doesn't guide them and coach them. Doesn't every play, you got to coach every single last play on how to do it. So when you talk about intent versus impact and kids taking ownership of their choices or not taking ownership of their choices, explain that to the audience when you compare those two things, intent versus impact.
Absolutely. So one of the things, and again, I say these with all transparency, intent versus impact was something I stumbled onto. So I love the fact that I've learned so much accidentally, and I own that. But intent versus impact, where it really came from was in restorative practices. The one thing that I was grounded in being in discipline was I didn't hear a lot of accountability and responsibility owned by the students. And what I started noticing was a trend, Mari, is that when students would act out, a lot of times they would use this phrase, well, if I didn't intend to make you feel that way, you shouldn't feel that way. And so I started to notice this vocabulary and the language, and what they would always focus on was whether they intended to or whether in correlation to their impact. And I started to notice that kids particularly would disengage with owning and being responsible for how they impacted somebody because they kept copping out saying, well, I didn't intend to. And I hear this, and be honest, I even hear it with adults, is that sometimes we've morphed the message and we've twisted it to say, well, if I didn't intend to, well, then you shouldn't feel this way. And I will tell you, one of the biggest things that I took away from entering restorative practices is you can't tell someone how they should feel. And I'm going to say that again for our audience, right? You can't tell someone how they should feel. And to be very honest, I was guilty of this. I mean, learning this, and I say this because I want us as adults to understand that we don't have it all figured out. And the things that I loved about getting into this business was I was in my second marriage. I remember my wife, who was a principal, she would be like, did you just tell me how to feel? And I'm like, what? I didn't do that. And she would be like, yeah, you did. And then I'd have to go back and we would replay the conversation, Mari, and I'd be like, oh my God, I'm doing this. So I say this with not like, look at what y'all are doing. I'm like, look at what I was doing. So if we go back to intent versus impact, what I started to notice is that for adults, when we work with students dealing with discipline and behavior issues, where we get stuck at, and if you don't know how to navigate through this conversation, is that the students will not hold themselves culpable or responsible because they'll be like, well, I didn't intend to. So I started recognizing intent versus impact, and what they saw is that we had to break it down very easily. And so how I work with kids and adults, but how I break it down for the kids is to say, hey, one day when you're going to be driving a car, I said, I don't think most of us, when we drive a car, we intend to run into somebody else, but accidents happen. I said, so let's just say a minor fender bender, you're backing out in a parking lot of something and you run into somebody. Did you intend to do that? And they're like, no. And I'm like, exactly. But let's say that you get out of the car and you see a big dent in the other person's car. Did you create that damage? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, but you didn't intend to. And so when you put it like that, all of a sudden they're like, oh. So I give you a real life scenario. So I remember at Ed White, we had a girl who came in and said, oh, Mr. Curtis, this girl just punched me in the cafeteria for nothing. And I'm like, I hear that, but let's just be honest. Like that rarely happens. Kind of what you mentioned earlier, Josh, anomalies. Like we don't really get kids to just hit somebody for out of nothing, right? So the more I dug deeper, here's what I found out when she got hit, she was actually with two other girls in the cafeteria, and they cornered another young lady that hit her. Now, when you understand the story context, right? Well, the three girls approached the girl in the cafeteria, earrings off, hair pulled up, right? You can read nonverbals, right? In an aggressive manner, right, Madi? So at this point, I said, oh, but see, here's what's funny is the girl that got hit, all she could focus on was she hit me. And I was like, okay, I'm agreeing with you that happened, but can we back, almost like a game film, like in football, Josh? I want to rewind. Go back. Let's talk about what happened. So when you came into the cafeteria and you talked to the other young lady said, hey, three girls came and approached me, and I could see, I felt nervous. I felt like they were aggressive, right? And so she said, what my mom told me is if you ever feel overwhelmed and there's more than one person, she's like, hit the biggest one and then run. And I was like, okay, so this is whatever this mom taught her. So she hit her. But here's what's interesting is that girl felt threatened. She felt threatened. And then I said, so when you approached her, what did you say? Oh, well, I heard my name was in your mouth and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, so you didn't just have a friendly conversation with her. But I couldn't get the girl who got hit, who actually created the threatening environment to begin with. All she was stuck on, it was like John Cusack in the movie with my $2. I just want my $2. All she kept repeating, Marty, was, but I got hit and I got hit. I'm like, but do you understand
not
how you
what she
participate?
did.
Right, but do you understand that you contributed to that threatening situation, right? And she could not put the idea that she hit the car and that she created the damage and the car just hit her back. So I say this because when you look at intent versus impact, if we're behavior specialists, counselors, administrators, support, when we work with students in behavior, the first thing that we have to identify is whether you intended to or not, it's a moot point. You still created a negative impact on this person's feelings, physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially. However you harm them, you created this, whether you intended to or not. And when we can get past that, then I can see, I'm all 100% driven by accountability. Then my goal is to work to the student to start saying, so now that you're aware of that, how are you going to start to see accountability and responsibility in the choices you made to contribute to that? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know what? What's funny about, and I know you're not done, Josh, but let me just kind of do a follow-up here. I can't tell you how many times principals, assistant principals, you name it, just because I was there, don't want to go to that level. I mean, it's a quick suspension. You hit them and bang, you're gone for 3 days and that's it, without really helping them rationalize what happened, so that when they come back from their suspension, from that consequence or whatever they're going to do, whether it's ISS or suspension, whatever they're going to do, if you don't bring those two groups of people together, those two groups of kids together to figure out what happened, what was the impact, what happened, so that they can kind of like water under the bridge, if you will. Because if not, they're just going to come back around. You punch me, well, guess what? I'm going to punch you back, right? And it's just a cycle, and it never ends. But I can't tell you how we have to address that, because if not, we're just spinning our wheels. But I love that you said that, because it's important for not only for us to discuss that, but for everybody who's on this podcast or listening to it in the rebroadcast afterwards, how important it is to take that extra step.
For me, it's a teachable moment that if I don't teach them, then they will, again, more likely repeat the pattern. But in addition to that, realistically, even if you repeat it, because the one thing I always say is we got to get rid of this phrase. We just, we as adults, I hear things saying, I just want to make sure this kid never does this again. And I'm like, did you just hear what you said? You just said, I want to hear this 8 or 18-year-old, they never do it again. They're kids. And at the end of the adult, we're in our 40s or 30s, 40s and 50s, and we're still doing the same thing. So I tell you this because I don't know when the teachable moment will tip enough, Madi, where the other person may say, you know what, maybe I don't want to impact people that way. I can't know the tipping point, but just as I teach lessons in the classroom, my job as a school leader is to teach my students the impact of their behavior and their choices and their voices in the classroom and in the building. And when they make a poor voice or a poor choice, at the end of the day, I don't expect them to be perfect, But I will segue on one more thing real quick, and I apologize, but you clicked something. You said, and I love that you said it, Dr. Moreno, because I'm going to tell you, Marty, I say this all the time. You immediately said suspend them for 3 days. Now, I paused that because some people in other states, Josh, right, as I've traveled across the country, Texas, we're limited to 3 days, 72 hours of suspension. But other states are 5 days, 10 days, right, more. But here's what I tell people all the time. One of the first shifts that we made at Ed White is that we said, somebody asked me this question. And if you're a school leader, particularly an administrator who applies consequences for discipline, my first question to you is, why do we always lead with our ACE card? Like, why do we lead with the most suspended reason? And when somebody asked me, and I remember when Jim Walsh asked me, like, well, why do you suspend for 3 days at a time? I'm like, I didn't have an answer other than, well, the administrators prior to me handed this philosophy down to me and I just adapted it. And I think it's universal. So I just, when you said that, it also touched my memory is unless I tell kids, like we went to partial day or full day suspensions, but unless you're a safety concern, then you need to get back to the campus because unless you're a safety concern, getting you rest of the day or 1 day is enough. Why do we need to do these multiple day suspensions? And I get it, they send a message, but realistically, I'm telling you, after 1 day, what's the reinforcement of the message? And I didn't mean to change the channel, but that
makes perfect sense. You're absolutely right because people do automatically throw the book at the kid and say it's 3 days. And then they do something on the day they come back and it's another 3 days. Well, when are you ever going to teach the kid? And when are we going to overcome all of these problems, right? And so and
hold on.
Isn't the answer.
And you know what? I know, Mari, you got the next question, but again, we're acting like old farts, all three of us. We can't assume that this kid that's 26 years old that just became an assistant principal knows this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Understand that. You know that right now we're hiring people too quick to sit in the chair. And they might have been stellar teachers. We don't know if they have stellar discipline as administrators. And the thing is, my inner Mexican, don't let it come out. Recidivists.
Recidivism.
That's the number one problem for assistant principals, or you're a small school, the principal. So how do you handle this, administrator out there? So we have to say that, you know, we got to talk down to make sure we know people are being elevated, and sometimes they don't have the full recipe to be a good meal, and people are being elevated to failure. And if we don't coach them and we don't prepare them for all these little minutia things, to us it's little and common sense. But that's because we got close to 3 decades under our belt. We know what's going on. We've dealt with schools of 2,000 kids. Yes. But that new assistant principal in Iowa that maybe has 200 kids has never dealt with this. So we got to make sure we say this to everybody out there. Mari, next question.
Awesome. So, Kevin, tell us why are connections considered fluff for many educators?
Well, and it's so funny because I have a lot of assumptions that I would make, but realistically, it's before I jump into responding to that, what I would be very curious is I'm almost tempted on my platform to literally, or even just on social media, to put that question out and ask administrators why they believe that. And the reason I'm saying is because if they did it anonymously and not put it out on social media posts, I really want to know some true answers. And I will give you my perception. In our training, we use a visual of a really big, strong guy, looks like Josh, right? Who works out in the gym and posts all yeah, right? So we got Josh, who's there. But here's the deal, Josh. You have a lower half that matches it. We have a graphic that has a big guy who has really skinny little legs, right? And so I laugh because when we show that graphic in the training, people giggle, right? Because I tell them these are the people in the real world that when you see them, you're like, dude, did you skip leg day? Like, did nobody teach you that? Like, you're so good at bench and shoulders and chest, right? You're like, forget the legs. I don't need those. But and it's so funny because when you see it in the real world, we kind of make fun of them. But when you do this, here's what I would say. On the graphic, what I tell them is nobody argues that the fundamentals, the legs, right, are the foundation of classroom, churches, communities, families. Like nobody argues that the foundation is the relationships and the connections. And if you take the analogy to sports, nobody argues, and I don't care what sport you are, from pickleball to football, everything starts from the ground up. So to me, that's why every sport says you got to have a foundation in the legs. But for me, what I notice in education is if we say the reps are in the relationships are your legs, then here's the question I ask is, when do we tell our teachers to rep the relationships in the legs? When have we told them, almost like personal trainers, Josh, right? If you tell your teachers, hey, don't forget to use the relationships and the connections in your legs. And what happens is I tell them, we may not physically look like this on the outside, but if you took an x-ray of us as an educator, we put content, curriculum, accountability, attendance, behavior, all of these things on our broad shoulders, right, Josh? But then we never tell them to rep the legs of the bottom half, which is the connections and the relationships. So when I look at this, what I believe fundamentally is flawed is that and I don't blame this on a person. I say the education ecosystem of education, right? The big broad pieces. There's so much about accountability and scores and testing and so much about that the first thing as most administrators do is they cut any relationship, any connections. They call it fluff because in their mind, what they think of is, oh, well, I could use less time of that and I could use more time to reading and writing and math and, all the other things. So what we do is as leaders is we overcorrect. Oh, reading scores suck. Oh, we got to, everybody go to reading. Oh, math. We just kind of pendulum swings back and forth. But in order to have a healthy homeostasis in our bodies, we got to have a balance. And for me is, I don't want connections and relationships to be overpowering. I just want them to come into focus and more balance. So when I look at this, I love to use James Comer's quote, no significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. And I make it very simple. If the state of Texas, for us, in other states, in Wisconsin and Idaho, as you mentioned, every state wants them to have significant scores. Well, in order for us to have significant scores, go back to James Comer's quotes. You're going to need significant learning. In order to get significant learning, you're going to need significant relationships. So the hard part for me is we're running on 2/3 of the formula. And I actually created a graphic in the book, and I do in a training. It's called the Educator Engine. And the Educator Engine, it's like every educator has 3 cylinders in their car, right? So whether you lead a school or you lead a classroom, everybody gets a 3-cylinder engine to lead in education. But the hard part is that the content and curriculum is the main cylinder that we drive in on a regular basis. And there's more accountability around that cylinder than anyone else. Then you move over to the correct cylinder, and this is behavior, discipline, disproportionality, all the things that we have to manage and put in plans. And there's a lot of accountability around that. But if you look at the 3rd cylinder, which I call connect, here's what's interesting is there's no accountability for connections. Like we don't require teachers to be accountable for creating connections and build relationships. So what I noticed, Josh, is when I go in, and I've worked in over 200 districts across the country. So when I go into districts, big schools, small schools, and I'm sure everybody has seen this, you've ever seen that building administrator and their campus is just accelerating past everybody else in the district, right? Or you go into a 4th grade hallway, right, Madi, and you see that one 4th grade teacher, you're like, why is she accelerating past everybody else? In my opinion, it's because they're using all 3 cylinders. And in fact, our hashtags are connect before content and connect before correct. So they're like, look, I don't care if TEA holds me accountable for this. I don't even care if my principal holds me accountable. I know that my best practices, I got to connect with kids, I got to correct kids, and I got to have high, and great content and curriculum to help them be successful. So it's when those teachers that put all 3 together. But until education holds us accountable to make that happen, most of us will operate on 2, and it'll be the first thing we cut to be like fluff.
And you know what? That's what I wrote about in my book, our book, about my last school and this school. And those of you that think that's fluff, and I know this for a fact, that there's administrators that make fun of me because of the stuff I put on social media. I spend all my time. This is one set of cards I wrote, another set of cards for another group of kids, another set of cards over here for a group of kids, welcoming kids that have perfect attendance, kids that got student of the week, and their birthday cards are down there. I'm gonna let you know, if you think that that's fluff, last year I could only bring you the receipts as this. I've got a campus of over 300, up to 500, depending on how many I go in and out. I only had 2 physical fights all last year. 2. And I had in 180 days 20 incidents with vapes or drugs. 20.
Wow.
And I've got kids that are 10-year-old to 20-year-old, 10 to 20. So if you consider fluff not working, and the previous campus that I was at did the same thing with 2,550 kids, went from a D- to a B- with fluff. Well, you know what? You should eat some of my fluff. Because let me tell you, I'm not giving you receipt. And you know what? If you don't like doing it and you make fun of me, that's okay. Don't worry about it. But I know what works because I have the receipts to prove that. So, hey, you know what, Kevin? Let's talk about discipline. You know what? That's very subjective. You could do this with on a PD for your campus, a PD for your district, and you might put a scenario, and you're gonna have 50,000 different ways of handling it. Well, every time I do this with our team members, they're always, oh, this is suspension. Oh, no, I don't look at this. Oh, no, but this is parent call. Everybody has their own version of discipline. Everybody considers what is air quotes right. But then they hold the chair accountable for what is right in their world. So when we talk about the hammer and nail philosophy and the behavior of holding kids accountable, what do you think?
So yeah, and it's a great segue, great setup. So when I talk about the hammer and the nail, I love looking at it from, so when you see a traditional hammer and you see a traditional nail, they complement it very well. Would y'all agree? And so when I use this, here's what I mean by this, Josh. And I'll use you as an example, Josh. So when the nail is the student, so I want you to imagine a graphic of just a hammer and a nail. Now, the nail is the student. The hammer is typically the adult or the adult figure in that life that holds the nail accountable. So that could be mom, dad, grandmother, grandfather, coach, person, any adult figure, right? And I go back to remember, Josh, and you mentioned this, we have a lot of wisdom on here, but our age and our experience, but we grew up at a time where we were told to listen to adults. And if we didn't, they threatened us with a hammer. And what I mean by, Josh, do I need to call your dad? Do I need to call grandma? Right? Because if abuelita comes up there, abuela, right? Like, Josh, you knew you were in trouble, right? Now, what's funny, Josh, you're moving your hand, but here's what I know is that when you're a hammer and a nail, and you're the nail, if the parent, first of all, do y'all remember when the parents used to show up to school? So we're going to go back in time for the hammer and so first of all, the hammers, one, used to show up. Number two, when they showed up, the first thing they did is they wanted to hear from another adult. Tell me what Josh did, right? So Marty, let's say you're the principal and you've called me up and I'm the father of Josh, right? And so I'm like, hey, Dr. Moreno, I got here as soon as I can. See, so notice the difference, because we'll flip this over to modern day, but back in the day, they would quickly get there to the school. Then, Dr. Moreno, whatever you told me about my son, Josh, I believed you 100%. Would you agree? Even if you manipulated your story and even, put extra in it, I still believed you 100%. And guess what, Josh? You never tried to explain nor defend yourself, because if you would have talked, you may have been physically harmed, right? Hence, you would have gotten the hammer. So, and we didn't call CPS. We just kind of looked the other way, right? We're like, oh, we're letting the parent handle this. So here's what I love about the hammer and the nail. The hammer works well with the nail. Now, when you look at it and we talk about new modern hammers, I have this graphic and it's funny. I have different funky looking hammers that are not very threatening or intimidating. So now when you look at the hammer and the nail now, notice that, first of all, the nails are not even nails. I don't know what they are, but if they have technology in their hands and they've reached out to their parent, they've already given their parent their narrative of whatever happened, correct? So now, Dr. Moreno, let's flip this over. Josh is a modern day student in 2024, and I'm a modern day parent. So now when I show up, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to talk to Josh. So notice, I don't even, I'll talk to you, but I want to talk to my child first. So notice that switch. And whatever Josh version tells me, I believe it. I believe 100% of the Kool-Aid of whatever my kid told me, because that's the new hammer and hammer and nail relationship, right? So then what happens is reluctantly, I'm going to have to deal with you, Dr. Moreno. Okay, principal, tell me what my son Josh did, right? And even when you tell me this violation of student code of conduct and all this stuff, right? I'm still probably not going to believe you. And in fact, you may even tell, I got 82 witnesses and 17 videos of your son Josh doing this, right? And even when you tell me 82 witnesses and 17 videos, they're still going to have a little bit of Shaggy in them. Are going to be like, it wasn't him. Right.
Yeah.
Like, so at this point,
someone influenced him.
right. Somebody influenced him. Somebody
else did it.
It's not right. Now, here's what I know. Then, and here's where we're in trouble, people, because I'm about to demonstrate as a parent in front of my son, Josh, how to handle this situation. So, Dr. Moreno, I don't like you. I don't like what you represent because, of course, you're picking on my kid. So I'm going to go off on you. I'm going to go off on your office staff. I'm going to go to central office. I'm going to go to Facebook, and I'm going to create a post. I'm going to go to social media. I'm going to just get a squeaky wheel going, right? So now we're teaching our nails. This is how you handle conflict and confrontation when you don't like the results. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, Dr. Moreno, you're still like, he's still suspended. And let's go with the typical 3 days. So now I got to take my son, Josh, home. Now on the ride home, Josh, I'm like, hey, Josh, some parents are going to be like, hey, I got to work. I'm not even going to watch you. Now, so you got 3 days to do whatever you want. You can run the streets, which now enters the school to prison pipeline, right? Where students of color are 3 to 9 times more likely to be involved with the juvenile justice system. Or, hey, Josh, you're going to be home for 3 days. Maybe we need to get you a new video game or something to play while you're at home, like something to entertain you for 3 days. Now y'all are laughing, and whenever I get laughs, that means it's real, right?
It's real.
Right. So you see this scenario, right? So understand the hammer and the nail. So the problem is that the hammer works very well with the nail. But here's what I know. Where are the nails? And when I say nails, I'm talking about the students that are sitting in your classrooms with 1 or 2 strong, influential parents that hold their students accountable, that give them discipline and behavior management, right? Like they work like the old style parents, and we have less and less of them. Yeah. And so what's happening is that if you're a true nail, Josh, and what's amazing about this is if you have a nail and a hammer situation, you don't even have to bring in the hammer. You just have to threaten the hammer. When you know you have a nail, and so for administrators, the first thing I teach you is when you have a student come into your office, you got to quickly figure out, is this a nail or a non-nail? Because if this is a nail, this is easy. Yeah. The reason being is I just call grandma. I call mom. And that's what as a coach, I'd be like, call Coach Curtis, call me to that classroom because I'll be worse than any of those other hammers. So when you have a hammer in your life, you only have to threaten the hammer, correct? And Josh, guess what happens? When a nail gets threatened with a hammer, guess what it does? It gets straight. And guess what happens? A nail is best hit when it's straight. Can you see the analogy there? Now, here's what's interesting is, under the nail and hammer, we're still threatening the same hammer that we did back when we were students, right, in school. And so now, have you heard the adults do this? Do I need to call your mom? And the kid's like, I already called her. You're like, oh, hell, right? And then you're like, do you talk to your mom? I text messaged her already. Like, oh, hell, they do talk to their parents this way, right? So we're threatening a hammer to a screw, and we're screwed, people. Because they're no longer nails. Like these are different fasteners, and we're like, do I need to hammer you? And they're like, go ahead, send me home. Go ahead, call my mom. Like the threat of the hammer no longer intimidates them, so we're screwed. And then I have a graphic that has 2 bolts, and I say, look at how trauma has infiltrated our schools. Look at these titanium bolts. Now, titanium, like a frying pan, you can't scratch it, you can't dent it. You could bring the biggest, baddest, biggest hammer and onto those 2 students who were fighting, that you can expel them. You can do whatever. You're not going to scratch their surface of their life because look at all the trauma and the things that they go through in the real life. But we think in education, we just need a bigger, badder hammer. And so I love Maslow's quote when he says, if you have a hammer, you tend to look at every problem as a nail. That was my flawed philosophy when I got this job at Ed White. I've only worked at Title I campuses, but going from a principal, going back to an assistant principal was very enlightening. And we can talk about that as we go through the show. But here's what I knew. I just knew I was a new hammer, a new sheriff, and I just had to be the biggest, baddest hammer. But my philosophy was flawed because these kids, I'm like, hey, you don't talk to adults that way. And they're like, I'll talk to you that way. And I'm like, oh, hell, these kids talk back. Mm-hmm. So the flaw of the hammer and the nail is, when you know you have a nail, use your hammer. But if you have a non-nail, using the hammer isn't going to get you the results that you need nor want to change the behavior. So we've got to change the tool belt that we're working with. And just like for teachers, you have 87 different ways for a student to learn how to read. We have to take the same philosophy. So why I preach and teach differentiated discipline is just like we differentiate instruction, we got to differentiate discipline based on the students that are sitting on the other side of the desk from us.
So talk to that alternative certification teacher that's out there, right? Who is dealing with this, because whether it's that alternative certification teacher or that principal who still wants to do the old school kind of stuff and says, well, who cares? Just suspend them anyways, because I know mom doesn't care, but at least we have them out of our school for 3 days, kind of thing. For them, it's kind of like
it's a break,
out, right? It's a break.
That's why I said I think for our challenging students, everybody needs a break, right? But why does it need to be why does it need to be coded at 21, right? Like, because the minute you turn it into a code and you turn it into a referral, that's not a break. That's going to be a discipline issue, a violation of student code of conduct, which requires a consequence. So the best way that I've unpacked it for teachers, whether they're alt cert, regular teachers, or administrators, under this methodology. So just like for different, and I just alluded to this, but I set it up for this way. When teachers, I want teachers that are listening to this, and administrators, but I want teachers to think about this for a second. What if, hypothetically, your district just hired a brand new superintendent or director of academic success, right? And so this person is very analytic, almost like Moneyball. Like, it's very analytic, not personal. And so let's say that we do an activity where they have now deemed that there are hundreds of ways to differentiate instructions, but they've narrowed it down, and now they've mandated in your district that your teachers can only teach using 3 strategies. So I want you to imagine every teacher in your district now is micromanaged, handcuffed, and stifled, and said you can only teach using these 3 strategies, but yet all your students still have to be successful. If that was a reality, what would be some adjectives of how teachers would feel if that was being placed on them? How would they feel?
It'd be terrible, right? I mean, they can't be the creative, wonderful teachers that they want to be, because they're stuck to those 3 different strategies that you're giving them. So yeah, it wouldn't be fun.
It wouldn't be fun. I've heard words like, I'd be pissed. You don't trust me. You don't let me do my job. You micromanage me. You stifled me. Like, I've heard some really, really powerful adjectives, right? And so what I tell them is okay. So
actually, there's a school district that is taken over by the state, and they're doing that. But okay, go ahead, move on. I just wanted to throw that out there.
It's good. So, but here's the reality. If we lived in that, where now they were expected to still have 100% success for all of our students to be successfully academically, but they were only allowed to use 3 strategies to get students to read or convert a fraction or whatever, they would feel like, I need to work in another district where they allow me to do my job. So what I do is when I do that, it's all a setup. And here's why I set it up with. I say, welcome to the world of as an administrator. I'm left with 3 tools to change kids' behavior: in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and detention. And let's just be honest, every state's different, but here in the state of Texas, K2, you can't even use suspension. So you now have less than 3 tools. You only have 2. So imagine, as an administrator, my job is to support discipline and behavior, but ultimately to try to change the student, right, from making better choices at the end, but I'm limited to 2 or 3 tools. So what teacher would use 3 tools, and after you use 3 tools, if it was unsuccessful, you'd be like, I just go to another one, right? But how many times are we suspending a kid? 9 times, 10 times, putting him in ISS for 23 times? What teacher academically would do something 13 times unsuccessfully? Everybody's got a little bit of baseball in you. You'd be like, all right, Marty, I tried to get you to read these 3 strategies. It didn't work. So I'm just going to move on to another one. So teachers have 87 tools to help academically students be successful. So the part for me, what stood out is in education, we are all pro differentiating instruction. But when it comes to differentiating discipline, we're like, no, you can't do that. And I'm like, why? Because what's fundamentally is nobody disagrees that all students learn differently. So if we all learn differently, and that's the fundamental process, what's the difference between learning how to convert a fraction and learning how to behave, or learning how to not blurt out when somebody else? So to me, it's learn. But what we're using is we're totally open to the concept that I got to find however way to get to the student to learn how to read. But when it comes to behavior, we're very limited. And so when we use that approach, that's my first open dialogue. Then to go, oh my God, I never thought about as an administrator, I'm limited and micromanaged and handcuffed to only use one or two. And you mentioned it earlier, Josh, then when I use those, you don't even support me. You don't even like it. So we're really caught up in this cycle. And my thought about differentiating discipline is I want to break that cycle. I want to break the norm that we differentiate discipline just like we differentiate instructions, because at the end, in the real world, if you get involved, even if it's just a police pulling you over on like a speeding violation or a tag violation, right? What do the police always tell us? If you're honest, you're forthright, and you're open with me, I'll work with you. So what's funny is in the real world, we all want the police to work with us. But what's amazing in the school is if I have two students who violate student code of conduct, but one is accountable, responsible, willing to own it, do whatever I got to do to move forward, and the other one's like, F you, I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
Why do I have to give the same consequences? And that's where we got to break outside the box, is because this student is being accountable, responsible, whatever. They still get a consequence, but why do they have to be the same? That's the mentality in the box that we've got to break out in. And again, this is where I cut against the grain, where some people are like, you don't get it. And to be honest, I'm like, no, you don't get it.
Yeah. So who do you think teaches teachers how to connect with students?
It's a great question. Well, I think here's what I would say. I think when I was doing my podcast and I was having conversations with building principals, and even when I'm at TASSP and I have a booth or something, right? Like, I love these dialogues, but I will tell you, I think most school leaders convince themselves that somehow they're doing it, but I don't really think they know that they're actually doing it. I don't think we're ready to say, like, nobody teaches my teachers. I think what principals are saying, like, we're good. The other thing is again, capturing kids' hearts. It's been out there since, forever. There's a lot, there's a few things, but in my opinion, where they come short is they didn't take it to the depth of what I was able to look at it from that perspective. Like, for example, I created through this toolkit, the Teacher Connection Toolkit, I created 4 tools that take less than 2 minutes to create connections in the classroom. And not only do they create connections, but they have to create connections in 3 areas. And I think this is where even capturing kids' hearts, which is amazing, falls short. So, like, for example, when capturing kids' hearts does good things, right? Student stands up, we come up with the weekend, we do like 3 or 4 students, tell me a good thing. It's a powerful, positive way to create a connection. But here's what I've noticed is we learned about 4 kids. Okay, that's great. What about the rest of the kids? What about the teacher, right? So one of the things that stood out for me is that I was literally in Pflugerville having a training. It was 2:40 in the afternoon. I needed a Dr. Pepper to just push through that last 45 minutes. And I remember a teacher walking up, Josh, and he said, hey, I'm really loving today. And again, informal conversation, just sharing a Dr. Pepper in a conversation. I said, dude, I love this, man. I'm so glad that you're loving today. But here's what really stood out for me. I said, hey, what is your go-to relationship building activity? Not the tools that I'm giving you. Like, what have you used in the past? And here's what he told me, Josh. He said, oh, I do the brown bag. And I said, oh, okay, the brown bag. And if y'all are not familiar with the brown bag, it's like show and tell on steroids. Kids bring 4 objects in a bag. They reveal them. So it's basically like show and tell times 4, but it comes in a brown bag. And so you're revealing them. I said, okay, I'm familiar with the concept. So here's my question to this teacher. I said, hey, when the kids are unpacking the bags, do the students learn a lot about each other? He's like, this is one of the best opportunities because kids are learning all about each other from the 4 objects. I said, okay. I said, are you learning a lot about them? He said, of course, so much that I have a clipboard because everybody's doing 4 things with 100 kids. That's 4 other things, right? I said, but here's where the profound question I got. I said, so again, took a sip of the Dr. Pepper and I said, so what do you typically put in your brown bag? And he said, I don't do a brown bag. Now, I'm looking at y'all's facial expressions, and I love doing this when I watch my audience and I'm training them. And here's what I tell them. I made an assumption that I thought that a majority of teachers would all do brown bags, right? Like, why wouldn't you do a brown bag? But here's what I love this question. So when I didn't condemn him, I was curious, and I said, so why didn't you do a brown bag? And you're never going to believe what he told me. He said, because the directions didn't tell me to. So look at that face, Marty. Now, hold on. Josh, do you see her face? And the reason I'm saying that, your reaction, that was another 2x4 moment that I put in the book. And here's why. I said, so wait a minute. There are teachers. I thought the norm of teachers would automatically embed themselves into community building and connections in the classroom. But here's what I've learned. Teachers are great soldiers. Just tell us what to do, sir.
Yes.
Right, Josh?
Yes.
And so
yes.
we're so good at telling directions. So I literally got home and I Googled the brown bag and I went through everything on the internet that I could find the brown bag. And in nowhere in the brown bag directions did it ever explicitly tell the teacher to share a brown bag. Now, for those teachers that their little heart just broke through that story and said, why wouldn't that man share a brown bag? I thought the same thing. And I thought that was the norm. But what I realized is for those of us that would naturally share a brown bag, you're the exception. The norm is nobody told me to do. So if that is the reality, I had to come back and tell my staff, guess what, guys? I figured this out. We have to tell teachers when kids should talk to each other. We have to tell teachers when they should share. We have to tell teachers when they should listen. So out of this conversation, I created cross-connecting. So cross-connecting is student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student. So every one of my tools must do 3 things. And teachers, every time you're building connections, so if you're a teacher out there and you're using connections and relationships, here's all I'm going to tell you. I would love if you get and look at the book and see what the tools do. But here's what I'm going to tell you: if you're doing the brown bag or 2 truths and a lie or a poster about me, here's what I'm going to tell you to do. Don't forget that there are 3 outcomes to community building: student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student. But here's what teachers 90% of them say: I'm good with my kids. And I'm like, great, that's 1/3. And they're like, what? And the biggest aha is the student to student connection. If you were going to say which one out of those 3 stands out the most, I cannot tell you how many teachers post-training, and let's say second semester, and I think this is profound, they'll say, I put my kids together in these connection activities second semester, and they're like, we don't know each other. The light bulb was like, they go to the same school, they live in the same community. You think and you assume that these kids all know each other, but they don't. So the student to student connection, the student to staff, and the staff to student, you got to create that triangle effect every time you do one of the tools. So when you do good things, 4 students stood up and I'm like, okay, that's great, but we didn't learn about anyone else. And did the teacher do a good thing? And the one thing I've learned about capturing kids' hearts is they're phenomenal. But here's what else I know, but they don't tell the teacher to specifically share a good thing. So this is where I felt like I could close the gaps. And the biggest pushback I got beyond the fluff methodology is that we don't have time. So I built 4 tools that take less than 2 minutes, and we use timers to make that happen. So the fact that I could create 4 tools that take less than 2 minutes to create connections, student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student, that is what fundamentally changed the game for me and which allowed our business to blow up and to be in 200 districts because people were like, nobody's teaching us that. And to me, that's where this book was birthed from. And that was the gap that I started to address.
And that's in your book. I want to make sure that was highlighted, right? So as soon as that book is out, folks can go out there and purchase this book because those strategies are in there, right?
Yeah. So every single tool, in fact, not the hammer and the nail, but the differentiated discipline, about all of those activities are all in the book. The book is just a mirror of my training. So all the activities that I take you through training, all the fundamentals are in there. The tools are in there. And here's what I would tell you. The payoff, because here's what I want teachers and educators and leaders to understand. What is the ROI, the return on your investment? So I had to make this very clear that and I think fundamentally people don't disagree with this, but the more students get to know each other, the better they treat each other. Fundamentally, right? And Josh, you mentioned earlier, you have the anomalies, but I'm talking about the norm. So the more the students get to know each other, the better they treat each other. The more they get to know the teacher, the better they treat the teacher. The more the teacher gets to know the students, the better they treat the students. So in our data supports that teachers average about a 50% decrease in what I call those tier 1 behaviors that drive you crazy. Kids getting up out of their seats, talking over each other, just being disrespectful, not the major things, but they cut their discipline in half. And how? Because the more we connect with each other, I'm more engaged. I want to come to your classroom. My shirt says valued, seen, and heard. Ultimately, every one of these tools allows students to feel valued, they feel seen, and they feel heard. When I feel valued, I feel seen, I feel heard, I'm going to give my best. And when I don't give my best, I'm willing to reconnect with my community members when I feel disconnected. So we each, our fifth tool is our treatment agreement, which is our social contract, which holds the glue together to create that community. But if you're looking at reducing discipline and behaviors and disrespect in your classroom, what's amazing is most schools call me or email and say, we have a discipline problem. And I came up with this phrase, and I hope this will resonate with y'all, but I came up with this quote and I put it in the book, and it says, we have a connection problem that's disguised as a discipline problem. And what we're realizing is the teachers that have the most discipline issues typically have the least connections with the kids. And I see your head shaking, and almost every school leader says the teacher that connects with the most kids, I rarely have to go to their classroom. Their scores are up above, right? So there is a flaw in our mentality, because connections and relationships is a huge payoff, but you got to be intentional to make this happen, and you can't consider it fluff.
Hey, Kevin, there's this cat I like. I was hearing his podcast, and he had kids on the podcast, and he was interviewing the kids, and the kid said something a couple of years ago that I keep in the back of my mind. The kid said, you expect me to content with you when you don't connect with me. And so that guy on his podcast kept talking about how us as administrators need to give the blessing and role model what the connection is with our students. And so that's why I feel that, I just ranched it up a bit by doing it. I'd rather spend time doing this. Than dealing with this.
Yes.
If you know. Out of everything, you don't want to deal with that and the cheerleading mom. Those two.
The cheerleader mama.
You don't want to deal with those two. And so you need to make sure that you give grace to allow, because SEL, this wise man also taught me that SEL is not another thing. It should be the thing, especially in the post-COVID era. And so, you know what? I talk about this when I've been featured on podcasts, that I bring up Mike Tyson a lot. And when they interviewed Mike Tyson, he said that everyone had a plan for him until they got punched in the mouth. And you know what? You might have the best pair deck activity. You might have the best near pod activity. You might have the best Socratic circle, whatever it is. But if you don't have that connection with kids, all it takes is uno. All it takes. So when you have connections plus chaos, Kevin, it's still what? Chaos.
Yeah.
So talk to everybody about that.
Yeah. So it's so funny. And to be honest, Marty, I'm so glad that the book didn't get published, because the last couple of years, I recognized there were some things post-pandemic that I would have put in the book if I would have published earlier, and I would have had to come back. So one of the things that hit me last year is I was going through campuses, coaching, consulting, going into classrooms, modeling these tools. And I walked into a teacher's classroom that had 26 years of teaching experience. So what really threw me off was this teacher had a lot of years experience, but here's what I came in. When I watched this, I came up with this phrase called chaos times connection still equals chaos. It's the multiplication factor of 0. And it made me pause, because I'm very guilty of preaching and teaching that the concrete of connections, right, will be the foundation for everything that you can put your school on. But then I had to backtrack and I had to crawl at and say, wait a minute. If you have chaos going in the classrooms, you can't even get to connections. And it made me have to rethink my methodology. And it made me almost think like, and I put this in the book as a caveat, but it says like, when you pour concrete, underneath that concrete is rebar and gravel and those things. Well, that's classroom management 101. That is what I realized, that some teachers, whether you're coming alt or new or even older, if you don't have those fundamentals down, you can't even get to connections. Because what I watched was a teacher of 26 years watch 2 young ladies hold learning hostage for 10 minutes. We couldn't even get to connections because she was like, we'll wait. And I was like, how long are we going to wait? Because once these 2 students recognize that they have the power to hold off at learning, they're going to take advantage of that. So it made me start walking away, is that when I go into classrooms, if you don't have chaos out of the way, you can't even get to connections. Because then what they do, though, Marty, is that they blame my tool on the chaos. And I'm like, no, you had chaos to begin with. The tool didn't help you because you had chaos. So when you have chaos and you don't have calm, clear expectations, and students know what a ready to learn looks like, then what happens is you can't even get to connections. So as much as I love teaching and preaching about connections, I also pause and say, if you can't eliminate chaos and you have some type of control with calm and clear, consistent messages, then you can't even get to connections, because you got to get that fundamentals down first. And I think that was an aha moment for me, because again, I make a lot of assumptions. I'm like, oh, everybody knows, everybody's got Classroom Management 101 down. And I'm like, no, they don't have that. So when you think about it from that perspective, chaos times connection still equals chaos. It's the multiplication factor of 0. And if we don't take that into consideration, teachers will lean into connection activities and they won't go well due to the fact that it's still chaotic. And then they'll end up blaming the tool instead of owning the fact that they had chaos to begin with.
Excellent point. And that's a good point to talk about, because we have to have classroom management under control and we have to take care of that. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's important to have that and be cognizant of that. My question to you, or my next question is, you changed the name from National Educators for Restorative Practices to Differentiated Discipline. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. So when I first started this work, right, and just to give you the background, right, so when I looped up with my kids at Ed White. So we piloted this. The University of Texas had the Institute of Restorative Justice from Restorative Dialogue. They codified the process. We had 24 districts. TEA came to visit us. They kind of deemed us the flagship of the state of Texas as the first restorative campus-wide approach, right? And then when TEA wanted to start doing consulting, they were like, we need a voice. And they lured me out with an opportunity. And so in 2015, at the end of June, I didn't retire, but I went from the inside of education to the outside. That's how I tell people, right? But I did it with no salaries, no benefits. I walked away from TRS. Like, I just took a leap of faith, because I realized I was a cog in a wheel of a system that was set up to help particularly for my students of color. And being in a Title I campus my whole life, like, those are all my students. And so I just felt like I was a cog in a wheel. And if I just left, they were just going to replace me with another cog. So I'm going to move to the outside to make a difference. So when I first started out, I was so into restorative discipline. My first name was RD360, because it was all about the circles and it was all about RD, restorative discipline. When I co-published the book, Restorative Discipline Practices, right? Like, it was all about RD. The state was calling it RD. So for me, I picked up that name as an individual. But then when we grew in the state of Texas, after traveling all 20 service centers, I did a 2-year tour, trained 1,000 administrators for TEA-UT. I came up with TexRP. So I was Texas Educators for Restorative Practices. We were red, white, and blue. It looked like a Texas flag. It really resonated. That's when we had our first conference up in Arlington. And so I stayed with TexRP for about 1.5 years, and then we grew. And before you know it, we were national. And I put NEDRP in my back pocket. But for the next 7 years, we were National Educators for Restorative Practices, or NEDRP. And fundamentally, that was our identity. That was our brand. That is who people knew us. But it's interesting, believe it or not, people would be like, shouldn't it be NERP? And I was like, yeah, but that wasn't available. So I did NED, and the ED stood for National Educators for Restorative Practices. And it was all about restorative practices. And I loved the journey that I was on for those 7 or 8 years. But what I started to notice post-pandemic primarily is that over the years, there are some school districts that have had a positive and sometimes a negative experience surrounding restorative practice.
Restorative, yes.
So in fact, I saw a video on TikTok that said restorative practices is dead. So I started just really hearing this. And fundamentally, when I started my branch and my business, I was intentionally creating a name where it was about restorative practices. And I tell this people because restorative justice, restorative discipline, restorative practices, they all have 3 different connotations. But what I tell people all the time is I met RJ people, restorative justice people who do this for a living outside the real world, outside the school system. Then I was an RD person. I'm rooted in discipline. So I'm an RD and I met RJ. And then I melded and decided I wanted to operate in RP, restorative practices. And I felt like that was successful. But because is
The
restorative
word
practices.
restorative is still there.
Well, but so that's what's so funny. The word restorative is still there and you can't escape it. And so with as many consultants and books and ideology over the last 10 years, restorative has come up with its own version of whatever it looks like. And because it looks so different in every school system and inside schools and outside of schools, I think people have negative and positive experiences with it. And in fact, one of the things that I always prided myself in was the restorative practices model that I was building was for schools by schools. Like it was an educational model, because the hard part about being a restorative practice is in the real world, you can have 2 or 3 hours or 2 or 3 days to deal with a big conflict and to sit down and take it. In the school system, orale, we got to go with this quick, right? So the hard part for me was
for social workers, right? Social workers tend to do lots of restorative because they have hours and hours to work with kids.
Well, but they can have hours and hours of training. So the hard part is people would hire me and they'd be like, all right, in 6 hours, can you just make us a restorative community? And I'm like, no, like this isn't a pill you take, right? So the hard part is why I chose to really shift and rebrand is I was getting caught up with, and one, just being very correct, political agendas, right? Like some districts and some states, here's what I've learned. Some states and state legislation have banned the use of the name of the word restorative practices. Like even in Nevada, I was doing so much work with the Department of Education in Nevada, but then a new governor came in and you slashed the words and things. And so you just started noticing there was this pushback and everybody was gleaning their own idea and version of what they thought restorative is. So good, bad, or indifferent. What I noticed is that some school districts, being very direct, they would have superintendents or people in leadership positions that said, we don't really want to be involved with restorative practices. So I was losing out on opportunities. And in fact, to give you a best example, I went to not pitch, I went to speak at a school about this. And the director came back and said, my leadership won't buy this because of what it's called. So I came home and I typed it up and I put RAP and I sent him everything I do. And I called it Relationship Accountability Program. And he said, dude, like, we're all in. And I said, here's what's funny is I was like, it's the exact same thing I said. I just changed it from, to RAP. You put I put Relationship Accountability Program. And he's like, we buy it all day long. So here's what I can tell you. Vocabulary is king. And in fact, even when Dr. Lang and I were working together, the state of Texas decided to call it RDP. And I voiced my opinion. And I will say it here on this platform, whenever we put the word discipline in, immediately as educators, we have our own version of what discipline means. Pain, punishment, blood, if you could legally get it, right? It's going to be something negative. But here's what I've known. The minute you put the word discipline in it and you try to put another word or vocabulary surrounding it, the first thing that they're going to stick is, well, where's the discipline? Because it has the word discipline in it. So that's why I said, stop. I don't use restorative discipline. I don't use RDP. I took the word discipline out of it because at that point, I literally was teaching educators, like the minute we put discipline in it, you're going to expect the old ways. And I'm trying to make you think new. So it was putting you a conflicting message. And for those of you that are out there that may have already tried RD or RP, can I just give you an insight? You have one chance, and I truly say this, you got one chance to mix this Kool-Aid, and if you jack this up and you say, oh, well, we tried restorative, whatever, and now we want Kevin to come in and try to fix it, the teachers are going to be like, we tasted this Kool-Aid already. So you can't relabel it, right, from Coke to Pepsi or vice versa and try to get them to drink it. So you get one chance. So when I work with districts, I tell them, what are we calling it? Because vocabulary on how your teachers perceive it, right off the get-go, in the minute they had the word restorative, there were so many connotations of it. So what I felt like was, and as an entrepreneur, because I am an entrepreneur in this space, here's what I've learned. If you don't innovate, you evaporate. So for me, what pushed me to move and rebrand was 100% of our customers who reach out by email or phone call come in through the discipline and behavior issues. Like that's the door that they enter the conversation with. So if 100% of our schools reach out at discipline and behavior, then the first thing I recognize is I want to clearly articulate my brand that deals with discipline. And I had developed the concept of differentiated discipline years ago. So for me, I was like, hey, I want to make sure that any school system who reaches out to us knows that we're still in the discipline and behavior game, but it's not just about restorative. So the umbrella, so basically I had to cut the front of the window off and say, hey, we're differentiated discipline, but we're still doing the same things that we've done. But it's amazing that the conversations I have now are less pushback about restorative and more about, tell me more about differentiating discipline, because that alliteration and that connection between differentiating instructions and differentiating discipline, like that intrigues people. So, and I'll be very direct, and we talked about this before the show, how I ended up with the color purple is I kept telling people, I don't want to be blue, I don't want to be red, I don't want to get caught up in politics. And so it's amazing, if you're not blue and you're red and you put blue and red together, you get purple. So I really landed in this purple space with a new name to make sure that I could keep up with the vocabulary and the way that educators are. Sometimes our leaders are like ADHD and they're like, ooh, what's shiny? What's the new word? What's the new buzz, right? So sometimes you have to come up with a new lure, a new catchphrase, a new something. And so with the colors, the change in the name, it was to make sure that I could stay in this game and help educators see the difference that we've made through these last 10 years. But again, I didn't feel like I wanted to evaporate. I wanted to feel like I was innovating, and I wanted to make sure that people clearly knew that what we brought to them was about discipline and behavior, and it wasn't just about restorative.
Awesome, Kevin. And you know what, Kevin? I know that Principal Cafele has talked about that, and Dr. Craig Boykin has talked about that they can't go to certain states with what they bring to the table, and that's out there. And I know George Valenzuela, who was on earlier in the show, in his podcast, talks about how entrepreneurs need to adapt to what the climate is, like you did to the purple. So thank you for sharing that for people that want to be consultants. Like we had David Adencibia week 3, and he just left the principalship, and now he's an entrepreneur. And so it's one of those things that you bring those nuggets of for people that want to take the next stage in their life, like Mari, who left the principal chair, and now she's an entrepreneur to do that. And you know what? We're about to close off right now, Kevin. And real quick, before we get into the Échale Ganas questions, Kevin, and I hope you did your homework, brother, because I know you're a football coach, and you're going to meet 5 stadiums. And I'm not talking about those rinky-dink 1A schools. I'm talking about 6A school stadiums. One of those South Lake Carroll stadiums. All right. So I hope you did your homework.
Yes,
tell the audience real quick about your TOT trainer.
Sure. So one of the things that I recognize, and this is a perfect segue. So for years, a lot of districts have hired us to come in and train the staff, support, coach, and do those things. But I also noticed that, again, we're having less and less time for professional development and professional learning. Budgets have been cut. Substitute teachers, and again, that's a whole nother can of worms, right? So what I've noticed is the landscape and the canvas of delivering professional development, professional learning has changed. So my thought was, and I've had people say this for years, is why don't you do a TOT? And for years, to be very direct, the reason why I didn't do a TOT was this was my own fear, is that if I put this in your hands, I can't guarantee your experience, and you would stand in front of the room with information, but no experience. Because people tell me all the time, oh, you're an expert. And I tell them I'm not an expert, but I am experienced. And in the experience earlier in my career, Josh, when somebody would say, so what does this look like in a kinder classroom? Well, earlier, I couldn't tell you that. Now I can tell you what it looks like in all of them. So my biggest fear was... Kevin, real quick.
I'm sorry, I apologize. A brand new teacher just logged in from West Virginia. Tell them what TOT stands for. She's never been in the classroom.
Absolutely. So TOT is going to stand for a trainer of trainers, or train the trainers, right? So that means I'm going to actually train other educators to replicate and go do what I do. So my other methodology and thought from this, and for me, I was actually going in a second master's in Christian ministry, is almost like discipleship. So how do I create disciples of the work that I do? Well, one, I've got the book out there. So the first thing I thought of it's time. It is time for me to start teaching people to do what I do for a living. So then therefore districts who have said, well, you know, if we only have to use you, we have to rely on you. Well, at this point, I've totally transformed this. This summer, we had our first 22 people come. They came to Austin for 3 days. I turned the presentation over there. They get a manuscript. They get the training materials. They get everything to go back to their district and train their own staff. And that investment for them, that means they can continue to do this and train new teachers, old teachers, whatever they want to do. And
when they want to train them.
Whenever they want to.
Before school, during planning time, whenever, in little chunks and little nuggets. That's perfect.
Yeah. So no le hace, right? So for me, it was like, at this point, I'm like, hey, however I can help you. So I feel like at this landmark, for us to train other educators, what they've experienced is wow. In fact, we had 3 different service centers come, and Region 3 actually shouted out and said, out of all the trainer of trainers they've been to, they felt like, and their feedback was, this is the best training that they've ever been able to take back to their districts. And I took a chance because by training service centers, let's just be real, I'm putting it out there so those service centers can train those schools, and that doesn't allow me to train them. But here's what I've learned. I'm not in this for the money. I'm in this for the movement. I want to create an impact. When you fold a piece of paper, you create a crease. I want to create a crease in connections and education that outlive my lifetime. And with this book, and I want people to train. And as you mentioned, Josh, I'll be 55 next month. I can't continue this pace that I was at 160 days a year, traveling or whatever. So I just felt like it was the right time to start putting these tools in other educators' hands so that they can come back and train to support the teachers. And so by creating the trainer of trainers, we'll have it 3 times a year, 1 in the summer, 1 in the fall, 1 in the spring. There'll be 3 opportunities where you can come. And some school districts have found out I'm doing it. They're like, hey, can you just come to my school district and train us? We don't want to and so at this point, it seems to be the most popular way because, again, I'm putting the content and curriculum in their hands and they can do whatever they need to do it. And I think this is exactly about differentiating our instruction. This is about me differentiating and meeting professional development, professional learning where schools are at.
Hey, Kevin, real quick. An associate superintendent in Alabama logged in and heard you mention a lot service centers. Tell them real quick what a service center is.
Sure. Oh, so for us in the state of Texas, we have 20 of them. They're ESC. They're like central hubs for professional development. They're geographically located across the state. They are basically the lower cost or often free, divided by the state, provided by the state. So therefore, it's your central hub in your service center area. So in Austin area, we're Region 13. Region 13 is where you would go. Your schools would go within, would fall under that umbrella. And so they would provide leadership, professional development, anything that you're looking to support your teachers, those service centers are provided. But I can even tell you at Region 11 in Ohio, they hired me to come in there. So every state may call it something different, but it's these central hubs where PD and professional learning for your teachers to take them to the next level. They're just strategically placed across your state.
Especially since Texas is so little. So here we go. Let us close off. Young man, I know that no one's going to work tomorrow, but on Tuesday, maybe somewhere in the United States, it's day 1 with kids. And you know what? For us, it's going to be week 4 coming up on Tuesday. So I need you to inspire people. And you know what? Like I always say, ganas. Ganas is a spiritual word used by Hispanic culture. There is no equate. There is no English version. I don't know Vietnamese, so I don't know if there's a Vietnamese version. So all I'm going to tell you one thing is that this is a word that's stated from abuelita, 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 grandma, 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 to the next grandma, to the next grandma, all the way to the little baby that's 4-year-old changing a diaper. So we have that word, and we always say, échale ganas,
Échale ganas.
Échale ganas, mijo. And that is not just a word. That's meant through tradition. That's meant through a blood. That's meant through just acts of prior success. So right now, Kevin Curtis, it's not your stand-up. Hey, if you don't see his stand-up, make sure you follow him in the stand-up. Right now, we're ready to rock and roll to inspire you. So here we go. Words of wisdom from this young man. Give advice to either a new teacher or administrator.
Awesome, brother. Well, first of all, yo entiendo. So for me, for my ganas, what I would tell you is this. I'll layer this advice in 2 layers. The first one is, and this goes back to actually my first episode of my podcast with Joe Beckman, is educators, if you're coming back into the classroom for the first time for the school year, or you're already in week 4, it doesn't matter where you're at. The one thing that really stood out for me is educators, whether you're leading or in the classroom, we're always pushed to be so extraordinary. When do you ever just get to be ordinary? And I say this is because there is so much pressure put on us to have everything put together and to be perfect and to give out the best lesson and everything. But I want you to remind yourself what the students are expecting you to be is just at times be ordinary. And I tell you this because on the podcast too, Trevor Taylor mentioned, he said, your students show up waiting to see for you to make the first move. So what they're doing is your students are coming in and they want to connect and they want to get to know you, but they're very a little nervous and you're the adult in the classroom. So the first thing you got to do is you got to step forward. You got to meet them first and then they'll step and reciprocate. So the first message I would say is don't just focus on always being extraordinary. Take your teacher hat off for a moment at the beginning or sometime during that classroom, or principals, don't always just be so extraordinary. Let your teachers know that you're a real person, that you have real interests, that you have other things outside the school that you are about. The hardest part is sometimes our leaders, they put themselves up on such a pedestal and you're so far away. I want you to come down. I want you to be ordinary. You can still maintain respect and dignity and have that hierarchy in there, but being extraordinary. And then the second part of this is something that I've learned is whatever you're leading as an administrator or whatever you're teaching in the classroom, let me give you this phrase. It has to be so clear that it cannot be misunderstood. Now, I'm going to say this again. Whatever the message is, you're preaching, teaching, or living, it has to be so clear it cannot be misunderstood. So we trained 4,000 teachers in 5 years in Killeen. And I remember in this middle school, Josh, they had a gingerbread cutout, like just a figure of this is what a successful student looks like at our middle school. And I loved it. But here's what I'm going to throw a curveball to them, and I'm going to throw a curveball to the listeners. So what does an unsuccessful student look like? Because here's what happens. We're so good at showing what an excellent student looks like, but not all students can meet that criteria, be excellent. So what I've noticed for schools is that we're walking around with students who are not always successful, but we haven't clearly told them, well, what do you do when you're unsuccessful? What do you do when your students walk around dysregulated around your hallways? And if you clearly told them where they should go, how they should handle themselves when that happens? Because to me, I think we make a lot of assumptions in our buildings and that we know the students, they know where they should go, but sometimes we haven't actually told them. So my message and advice is, as you're starting the year or you're getting into the new year is focusing on not always being extraordinary, just be ordinary at times and allow them to make that connection and vulnerability. But in addition to that is make sure that clarity is king. Clearly identify what the messages are to your students who are successful and unsuccessful students, because clarity is king, and clarity and consistency and communication would allow growth to happen in your classrooms on your campus. And I think that'll get you off to a great start to the school year.
Kevin, you know I love you, right?
Yeah.
You know I've been following you for years, right?
Yes, sir.
You're gonna get scolded.
You said come to my conference, and I went to your conference, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you owe me 3 stadiums already, bro.
Okay.
This is a lightning round, bro. Lightning round. Lightning round, bro. Let's go. You already had your chance for inspirational. Let's go. Lightning round. Here we go. Read a note, an email, or text from a teacher, student that inspired you.
Sure.
Lightning round.
A student wrote me from Ed White Middle School, messaged me on Facebook and says, I don't think I never got to say this to you, never known how to, but thank you for being there when I needed you and being like a dad I never had.
Eso! Send some flowers to a current educator who inspires you. And why do they inspire you?
Sure. Jonathan Grant Brown in the Dallas area. Jonathan Grant Brown inspires me because of his story of how he grew up. He is big into Avid. His story is inspiring me and makes me want to inspire other educators. So reach out and look up to Jonathan Grant Brown.
Who else should people follow on social media? Give me one name.
Dr. James Whitfield in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Dr. James Whitfield is an amazing educator, shares a lot of insight and inspiration. And so for me, it's followed Dr. James Whitfield.
One song that embodies you. What's your essence, Kevin? Una canción.
Sure. Mercy Me, I Can Only Imagine.
Who sings that?
Mercy Me is the
Oh.
name of the group. It's a Christian song.
Thank you, brother. All right. What's your favorite quote, and why is that your favorite quote?
Sure. People are trying to tell you who they are all the time. All you have to do is listen, because when you listen to that quote and you truly understand, you will stop blowing off the red flags, because people are trying to tell you who they are all the time. All you have to do is listen.
How can people reach out and connect with you?
Absolutely. The easiest way to find me is at D Discipline. So just put a D in front of discipline. So ddiscipline.com.
Thank you very much, Kevin Curtis, for being here tonight. I really appreciate you. Let me tell you, it did not feel like an hour and 40 minutes at the very end. Thank you for being here. Please reach out to this guy. This guy knows what it's all about. He can give you his story about how he was the #1 top dog of suspending kids, and now he's on the other end of that. You know, that's another story. That's another podcast, and we will get back together. Hey, join us next week for the Principal Roundtable #2. And then after that, Teacher Roundtable #1. And after that, the coaching show. What coaching show? Not like UIL coaching or sports. It's principal to assistant principal, principal to future principal. So we're bringing in people that are within our sphere of how we coach them, and someone that reached out to a professional coach to bring them on board. And after that, we will have another Principal Roundtable #3. We have nothing but the best for you. Hey, Wisconsin, I need to hear from you. Hey, Iowa, I need to hear from you. Do the chats down here. Let us know what you think, and we'll see you next week. Remember, 6 p.m. Central Time on the PGP podcast, part of the Fantastic Four series, starting on Saturday with Coach Hurd, Shika Houston, Tammy Taylor, Principal Cafela, and myself. And don't forget, the audiobook is coming for Grow Your Why with Barbara Bray. So you're part of Socorro High School. You're part of the Memorial Pathway. You're in my thoughts and my love. Well, thank you for being here, everybody. Love you, care about you. Peace. Goodbye, everybody.